That's what happens when we let sin get out of control. It can lead to violence, but it will certainly lead to something not good when we let the sinful desires in our heart gain ground.
This is a Truth Transforms Truth Nugget, a daily dose of truth for your daily transformation.
So this is where it comes from. There's a war within, inside of us. It is a heart condition that leads to all the sin in our life and all the conflict in our life. It comes out of the heart, as Jesus says, and I continue to say, while preaching throughout James, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. It all comes from the heart, and it is all a heart condition. So there is a war within that will lead to a war outside if it is not dealt with. So we need to deal with the war inside then. We need to deal with the war in our heart. The passions that wage war in our heart are selfish passions, and every believer has a battle inside of you. Your passions are at war within you. So what are these passions? These passions are opposed to each other. These are desires in conflict with each other. It says they're at war. So they're not just sitting there latent. They're not just sitting there chilling. They're battling each other. They're at war with each other. And these desires, of course, are sinful desires and godly desires. There's a true battle going on inside. That there is a war going on inside, and it's between the flesh and the spirit. And you'll remember, I think someone talked about this. I think they did. The Apostle Paul talked about it an awful lot. In Romans 7, he talked about, I don't do the things I want to do. Instead, I do the things I hate. There's a battle between the flesh and the spirit. Galatians 5, he talks about the works of the flesh and the works of the spirit, the fruit of the spirit, and that there is a battle going on there, but we need to live in the Spirit of God. We need to walk by the Spirit of God. This is what he says in Galatians 5:16-17. He said, but I say walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you want to do. Does it sound like a battle to you? It sounds like a battle to me. They are opposed to each other. They are at odds with each other. And so later in the chapter, that same chapter, chapter 5, he talked about the works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. And he shows us then what it looks like to be guided by our sinful passions or to live in submission to God by the Spirit's passions. So how do we live by the Spirit then? How can we be guided by godly desires? Well, everything runs on fuel. We know that, right? Everything runs on fuel. You can't get in your car and drive somewhere if you don't have fuel in the car. You can't cook on the stove unless it has fuel. Everything runs on fuel. And so the question is, are you fueling your sinful desires or are you fueling godly desires? That's the question. Who are you preparing for battle is the real question. If there's a war inside our heart, if there's a war truly going on inside of us, which the Word of God says, so I believe that there is, and I believe through my own life that there is, so there is a war going on inside of us, so we need to ask ourselves the question, who are we preparing for battle? We are either preparing the enemy, we are going into the enemy's camp and giving them everything they need to defeat us, which is feeding our sinful desire, or we are feeding the Spirit of God through the Word of God and applying the Word of God in our life. It's either one or the other. We're feeding something and we're starving something. And so that's a question we have to ask ourselves, and it changes by the day, I know, and it changes by where we're at in our walk, but it's a question we ought to continually ask ourselves. When we go to the enemy's camp, it's like this. It's like we fuel the enemy, our sinful desires, and then Satan is ready to go to war and attack us relentlessly because Satan will use that. When we feed our sinful desires, he will use that fuel to attack us. We do it well ourselves, but Satan works through temptations, and that desire grows, and it fuels, and it leads to sinful behavior, sinful speech, sinful actions, you name it. So we need to pay attention to the battle inside of us. We need to pay attention to who we're preparing for battle. So are you fueling godly desires or sinful desires? Are you starving the desire to seek after God? and live according to His Word, or are you starving desires that are opposed to God? And in order to answer that question, we need to look at our response to temptations. How do we respond to temptation? When you're tempted to be envious, do you fuel that temptation or do you starve it? When you're tempted to dwell on ungodly thoughts, like a recent argument or a memorable insult, do you fuel that temptation or do you cut off the supply of gasoline? Do you get it out of your life? Do you eliminate the fuel supply? That's the question we have to answer ourselves. Do we go to God in prayer and give it to God in prayer, which will extinguish the fuel supply that it has, and it will actually help us fuel the right thing and prepare the right battalion for battle. So we need to stop fueling our sinful tendencies. Now, when we fuel our sinful tendencies, and maybe we're dwelling on something negative, maybe we're talking about something negative that has happened in a home, we're reliving it while we're talking about it, that desire is going to grow then. Our feelings will intensify. Our hurt will be relived. And the sinful desires to be bitter and vengeful will be well fueled and ready for battle. And so we need to make sure that we do not feed our sinful desires. And we need to cut off the fuel supply that allows our sinful passions to thrive. And we need to stop feeding our flesh and starve it from the sin that it craves. And we know the importance of this in our everyday life and other parts of our life. If you're going to go on a diet, if you're going to start eating healthy, what happens if you continue to eat the junk food? You're not going to lose your appetite for that junk food. What happens if you say, well, I'm going to eat healthy now, but you still go and sneak in that candy every now and again, your favorite candy? Well, you're not going to lose your appetite for that candy. It's not going to go away. But instead, if you decide to change your diet entirely, then you will crave that candy, you will crave that junk food for a little while, but that will eventually go away. Suddenly, you won't desire those things anymore. You'll say, you know what, I don't really want Pop-Tarts and popcorn and the other P I can't think of, or I want the good things like the fresh fruits and fresh salads. You know, that's what's going to happen. So. Sin is the same way. We must starve the sin in our lives. We must starve our sinful desires. We must recognize the sinful tendencies in our heart and starve it out of our life. And meanwhile, we must develop a taste for what God desires. Our heart must be turning to God to fulfill our desire. So what is the sin in your heart that needs dealt with? What is the sin in your heart that needs starved? Do you need to starve bitter thoughts from your mind? Do you need to starve vengeful scheming from your heart? Do you need to eradicate unhelpful worrying from your thoughts? What do you need to starve? We need to make sure we don't fuel the sinful flesh. Well, let's move on. Verse 1 shows us the war within. Now, verse 2 shows us the war outside. Verse 2. First part. You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. So once that sinful desire inside of you has its way, and you don't keep it in check, then it's going to move from internal conflict to external conflict. The war will move from inside your heart to a war with those in your life. So this might be a war with family, it might be a war with someone in the church, it might be a war with a neighbor or a business associate, but that war is going to move from within to outside. And the fight is no longer hidden, it's now out in the open. That's what happens when we're guided by sinful desires. Sinful desires turn into sinful actions. The desires that were waging war inside of us are now waging war in public. And sin grows up and matures, and we remember that from the beginning of James in chapter 1. He said in verses 14 to 15, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. And then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. And so it begins with temptation. There's a luring, there's an enticing, but when we give way to it, it grows. He gives the analogy of a baby. It is conceived, it is birthed, and it grows up when we nurture for the sin in our lives and the sinful desires and temptations that we give way to it. It will be nurtured and it will bring forth death. And I'll give you an example from this from the news recently. There was a fight at a baseball game, a Little League baseball game. And you're like, that's not good. The kids really got into it, right? No, the adults did. At a 7-year-old game where 7-year-olds are playing and the adults can't handle themselves, they can't control their own sinful desires, so they have a violent fist fight on the field where the cops had to be called. The 13-year-old umpire had to tell these adults how to behave. That's what happens when we let sin get out of control. It can lead to violence, but it will certainly lead to something not good when we let the sinful desires in our heart gain ground. So we don't want to let them gain ground.
Well, I do pray that was a blessing. Now do me a favor, and if you enjoyed today's Truth Nugget, go ahead and hit that like button. That really does help to spread this to more people. Also, if you're new to the channel, you've joined us in the middle of a series on the book of James. And you can find all of the Truth Nuggets on the book of James in a playlist that'll be available in the description and also on the channel homepage. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next episode.